He was thrown out on the street without even a chance to explain. The doctors thought they had made the right choice until a few days later when they found out who they had chased away. Where are you watching from? Write in the comments. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. The morning light filtered through the large bay windows of the UL's estate, painting golden streaks across the polished wooden floors. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and buttered toast lingered in the air as the household stirred to life. Peter Ewells, a man of 68 years, sat at the head of the breakfast table, flipping through the morning newspaper. His sharp eyes scanned the headlines, his usual routine uninterrupted even by the growing tightness in his chest. He had always been a man of resilience, a surgeon whose hands had once saved countless lives. Though retired now, he carried himself with the same authority that had once commanded entire operating rooms. His salt and pepper hair, neatly combed back, and the crisp white linen of his shirt spoke of his discipline, his unwillingness to let age dictate his presence. Yet, something was wrong. He could feel it. A dull ache had settled beneath his ribs, radiating outward in slow, insidious waves. At first, he dismissed it as indigestion, a mere inconvenience. But as the minutes passed, the discomfort deepened, tightening like an iron band around his chest. Sarah, the housekeeper who had served the Ewells family for over 2 decades, entered with a fresh pot of coffee. She placed it gently before him, her keen eyes narrowing as she observed his pale complexion. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Peter waved a dismissive hand, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just a bit of fatigue, nothing to worry about." But Sarah knew him too well. The man who had once performed 20-hour surgeries without so much as a complaint was now gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Before she could press further, he rose abruptly, intending to retreat to his study. Then it happened. A sharp, searing pain exploded in his chest, knocking the breath from his lungs. His vision blurred as the room tilted violently. His legs buckled beneath him, and before he could reach out for support, the world around him spun into darkness. Sarah screamed his name, dropping the coffee pot as she lunged toward him. The porcelain shattered against the floor, shards scattering like ice across the tiles. The sound barely registered in her ears as she knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she felt for a pulse. It was faint, erratic. Panic surged through her veins as she fumbled for the phone. With shaking fingers, she dialed emergency services, her voice barely steady enough to relay the address. The ambulance arrived in record time, its sirens cutting through the crisp morning air. Paramedics stormed into the house, swiftly assessing Peter's condition. One of them, a young man with sharp blue eyes, knelt beside him, checking his vitals. "BP's dropping. Pulse is weak. We need to move him now," he barked at his partner. They hoisted him onto a stretcher, securing the IV lines and oxygen mask as they navigated through the grand foyer and out into the driveway. Sarah trailed behind, wringing her hands in helpless worry. "He's a doctor," she stammered. "A great one. Please, take care of him." The paramedics exchanged a glance but nodded before loading him into the ambulance. As the vehicle sped through the city streets, Peter drifted in and out of consciousness. His mind was a blur, fragmented memories surfacing only to be swallowed again by the pain. He thought of his son, Marcus. He needed to call him, to tell him what was happening, but the effort was too great. Darkness tugged at him once more, and he surrendered to it. They arrived at St. James Hospital, one of the most exclusive private medical centers in the city. The emergency doors swung open as the gurney was wheeled inside, doctors and nurses momentarily glancing up before returning to their more urgent cases. The attending physician, Dr. Walter Grayson, barely spared him a glance as he reviewed the intake notes. A tall, well-groomed man in his early 50s, he prided himself on running a hospital that catered to the city's elite. He scanned Peter's disheveled appearance, a man in plain clothes, no ID, no insurance card in hand. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Another one," he muttered under his breath before handing the chart to a nearby nurse. "Place him in observation for now. If he can't provide payment details soon, we'll have to move him out." The nurse hesitated. "Doctor, his vitals are unstable. Shouldn't we at least run tests?" Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple as though the mere suggestion exhausted him. "Fine. Run the basics, but don't waste unnecessary resources. If he's serious about treatment, he'll find a way to pay." Peter was wheeled into a dimly lit room, the beeping of machines the only sound filling the sterile air. His breathing was labored, his body weak. He tried to speak, to ask for help, but his voice was barely above a whisper. Hours passed. Nurses came and went, offering minimal attention. The pain in his chest worsened, yet no one seemed in a hurry to do anything about it. Finally, Dr. Samuel Livingston entered, accompanied by Dr. Jessica Barnes. Both carried the same air of disinterest, their gazes clinical rather than compassionate. "Has he provided any payment confirmation?" Livingston asked. The attending nurse shook her head. "No ID, no insurance details on file. He mentioned a son, but no one has arrived." Barnes scoffed, crossing her arms. "They never do. They always claim to have rich relatives, but when the bill arrives, they disappear." Grayson entered then, rubbing his temple as though dealing with an inconvenience rather than a patient on the verge of collapse. He looked down at Peter, his gaze void of empathy. "Listen," he said, his tone cool. "This is a private hospital. We don't operate on charity. If you can't pay, we can't treat you." Peter's lips trembled as he tried to speak, tried to explain. Marcus would come. He always did. But they weren't listening. They never listened. As the night wore on, the pain became unbearable. He clutched at his chest, gasping for air, yet no one rushed to his aid. The doctors had already made up their minds. He was just another patient without means, and in St. James, that meant he wasn't worth saving. The sterile hum of machines filled the dim hospital room, their rhythmic beeping marking the passage of time like a slow, ticking clock. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, masking the faint metallic undertone of sickness and neglect. Peter Ewells lay on the stiff hospital bed, his breaths shallow, his body aching with a fatigue that seemed to seep into his very bones. His vision swam in and out of focus, and for a moment he imagined himself back in the operating room, a scalpel in hand, dictating instructions to a team that hung on his every word. But that was years ago. Now he was the one lying helpless, waiting for hands that never came. The door creaked open, and a nurse entered, her eyes darting toward the monitor that displayed his vitals. She hesitated, glancing down at him, her lips pressing into a thin line as though weighing whether or not she should say something. Peter tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. "Please," he rasped. "My son, Marcus. He'll come." The nurse hesitated. There was something in her eyes, pity, maybe, or the fleeting flicker of concern, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. She gave him a tight smile, the kind that people wore when they wanted to comfort but knew they couldn't do anything. Then, without another word, she turned and left. Hours passed. The pain in his chest ebbed and flowed, a constant reminder of his mortality. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but memories crept in like unwelcome guests. He remembered long nights in the hospital, standing for hours in surgery, never once thinking about the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. He had saved lives, brought people back from the brink of death. Yet here he was, gasping for air, alone in a place where he should have been cared for. He had always believed in the sanctity of medicine, in the principle that every patient deserved compassion, regardless of status. But that belief was unraveling before him like a fraying thread, each moment chipping away at the foundation he had built his life upon. The door swung open again, this time more forcefully. 3 figures stepped inside, their presence filling the room with an air of finality. Dr. Walter Grayson stood in the center, his expression carefully neutral, flanked by Dr. Samuel Livingston and Dr. Jessica Barnes. They wore the polished detachment of professionals who had long since shed any emotional burden their work might carry. Dr. Grayson folded his arms across his chest, tilting his head slightly as he studied Peter. "Mr. Ewells, we need to discuss your situation." Peter forced himself to sit up, though the effort sent a sharp jolt of pain through his ribs. His fingers gripped the edge of the thin hospital blanket, his knuckles turning white. "My son," he began, but Dr. Barnes cut him off with a sigh, tapping her foot impatiently against the tiled floor. "We've heard that already," she said, "and yet no one has arrived. No payment has been made." Dr. Livingston, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward, adjusting the stethoscope draped around his neck. "This hospital operates on very strict policies, Mr. Ewells. We cannot continue treatment without assurance of payment. We have other patients, paying patients, who require care." Peter felt his stomach sink. He had seen this before, back when he was a practicing surgeon. He had heard the whispered conversations between hospital administrators and insurance representatives, had watched as patients without means were quietly shuffled out, their cases deemed less urgent simply because they couldn't afford the right kind of care. He had fought against it then, but now he was on the receiving end. "I just need time," he pleaded. "Marcus is a busy man. He doesn't know I'm here yet, but he'll come. He always does." Dr. Grayson exhaled, his patience visibly thinning. "That's the problem, Mr. Ewells. We don't have time. Your condition is serious, but it's not immediately life-threatening, at least not according to the criteria we follow." Peter blinked. Not life-threatening? He had spent decades treating patients with conditions just like his, had seen men and women collapse within hours from what started as mild discomfort. How could they be so blind? Dr. Barnes arched an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "We'll give you until morning. If no payment is received, we'll have no choice but to discharge you." Peter felt something inside him break, not physically, but deep within his core. A quiet, painful realization settled over him. They didn't see him as a person. They saw him as a balance sheet, an unpaid invoice. He wasn't Dr. Ewells, the man who had saved lives. He was just a body taking up space in a bed that could be used for someone else. The doctors turned to leave, their decision made. Peter watched them go, his vision blurring, not from pain this time, but from something heavier: betrayal. The night was long. Sleep came in fractured pieces, interrupted by the sporadic groans of pain that forced their way through his chest. At some point, he drifted into unconsciousness, his mind slipping between fevered dreams and the harsh reality of his situation. He dreamt of Marcus as a boy, standing on the beach, his small hands gripping a seashell as he laughed at the waves lapping at his feet. He remembered the way his son had looked up at him, his eyes filled with unshakable trust. "I'll always come back to you, Dad," Marcus had once said years ago, after running ahead and realizing Peter was no longer by his side. Peter clung to that memory. Morning arrived, heralded by the sterile light of fluorescence flickering to life overhead. The door opened once more, but this time it wasn't the doctor's. Two men in hospital security uniforms stepped inside. One of them, a burly man with a close-cropped beard, cleared his throat. "Mr. Ewells, we've been instructed to escort you out." Peter's breath caught in his throat. "No, my son." The other guard, younger, his expression more hesitant, shifted uncomfortably. "We don't have a choice, sir. The order's been given." Peter tried to protest, tried to sit up, but his body refused to obey. The burly guard reached forward, gripping him under the arms, lifting him from the bed with practiced efficiency. Pain lanced through Peter's chest, but his cries of protest went ignored. He was half dragged through the hospital corridor, past nurses who turned away, past patients who watched with quiet horror. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard someone mutter, "That's not right." But no one stopped it. The double doors of the rear exit swung open, and a rush of cold morning air hit his fevered skin. The guards released him unceremoniously onto the pavement, his body collapsing onto the hard ground. His breath came in short, pained gasps. His fingers scraped against the asphalt as he struggled to push himself up. The doors shut behind him. He was alone. A gust of wind blew through the alleyway, carrying the distant hum of city life, of people moving, of the world continuing as if nothing had happened, as if he didn't exist. He tried to move, to call out for help, but his voice was weak, his body exhausted. Then, as the sky blurred above him, the pain in his chest surged, a crushing weight that stole the breath from his lungs. Darkness closed in. The cold pavement pressed against his cheek, the rough texture biting into his skin as he struggled to draw in a breath. The pain in his chest had grown worse, spreading like wildfire, consuming every inch of his body. His fingers twitched against the asphalt, his limbs numb and unresponsive. The world around him felt distant, a blur of muted sounds and dim morning light. Peter Ewells had never felt this helpless before. Not in all his years as a surgeon, not even in the most grueling moments of his career, when exhaustion had threatened to overtake him. He had always been the one in control, the one making the decisions, but now he was nothing more than a discarded body, left to wither away on the cold ground outside a hospital that had sworn an oath to heal. The doors behind him had already swung shut. The two security guards had disappeared back inside without a second glance, their duty fulfilled. There would be no one coming to check on him, no nurse sneaking out to offer a blanket or a whispered apology. He tried to move, to push himself up, but his body betrayed him. His arms trembled with the effort, his fingers scraping uselessly against the concrete. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, the weight in his chest growing heavier with each passing second. He needed help. He needed someone to see him, to recognize him as something more than a nameless patient without a file, without a bank account linked to an insurance policy. The alley behind the hospital was empty, save for a few scattered trash bins and the distant hum of the city waking up beyond the parking lot. He could hear the sound of traffic in the distance, the rhythmic honking of horns, the faint murmur of people moving about their morning routines. Life continued, indifferent to his suffering. A man passed by the entrance of the alleyway, a businessman in a tailored suit, his face buried in his phone as he briskly walked towards the main road. Peter tried to call out, but his voice was barely a whisper, lost in the rustling of wind through the buildings. The man didn't even glance his way. Minutes passed, maybe longer. His thoughts drifted in and out, his mind struggling to hold on to something, anything, that might keep him grounded. He thought of Marcus, his son, the one person in the world who would tear through the walls of this hospital if he knew what had happened. But Marcus didn't know. He was somewhere out there, going about his day, unaware that his father had been thrown away like an afterthought. Peter clenched his jaw, fighting against the encroaching despair. He couldn't let it end like this. He forced himself to breathe, slow and deliberate, though each inhale felt like a knife twisting deeper into his ribs. A door creaked open in the distance. Footsteps echoed against the pavement. For a fleeting moment, hope flickered inside him. Someone was coming. Someone had noticed. A woman stepped out from a side entrance of the hospital, a nurse judging by her uniform. She carried a trash bag in one hand, her eyes focused downward as she made her way toward the bins a few feet away. Peter gathered every ounce of strength he had left, willing his body to cooperate. His lips parted, his voice raw and broken. "Help!" The word barely escaped him, more breath than sound. But she must have heard something because she paused, her head tilting slightly as she glanced in his direction. For a second, their eyes met. Her face twisted with something. Hesitation, uncertainty, perhaps even recognition. He didn't know if she knew who he was, or if she simply saw an old man lying helpless on the pavement. Then, just as quickly, she looked away. She turned back toward the hospital, tossing the trash bag into the bin before slipping back inside, letting the door close behind her without another glance. The realization settled over Peter like a suffocating weight. They didn't care. None of them did. Not the doctors who had sworn an oath to heal. Not the nurses who had dedicated their lives to patient care. Not the hospital that prided itself on being a pillar of modern medicine. He was alone. A bitter laugh tried to escape his throat, but it came out as a wheeze, another failed attempt at something so simple, so human. His body was shutting down. He could feel it happening, the creeping weakness, the slow descent into a place he wasn't sure he could climb back from. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. The world around him faded, the sounds growing more distant. Then, suddenly, a voice. Deep, urgent. "Jesus Christ, Dad!" The words slammed into him, shattering the haze of unconsciousness threatening to claim him. Strong hands gripped his shoulders, lifting him gently, cradling his head with a familiarity that sent a jolt through his fading awareness. Peter forced his eyes open, and through the haze, he saw him. Marcus. His son's face was taut with panic, his dark eyes scanning him with a desperation that Peter had never seen before. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, his tie slightly loosened as though he had rushed here without a second thought. Peter tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "Stay with me," Marcus murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Just hold on, Dad. I'm getting you out of here." Peter felt himself being lifted, his son's arms securing him against his chest as if he weighed nothing. Then the sound of car doors opening, the soft leather of a seat beneath him, the low rumble of an engine roaring to life. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him again was the look in Marcus's eyes. Anger, fear, but most of all, a promise. He wasn't alone anymore. The low hum of the car engine reverberated through the leather interior, a steady vibration that might have been soothing under different circumstances. But in that moment, there was no comfort, no reprieve from the tension that filled the space between them. Marcus Ewell sat rigid behind the wheel, one hand gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white, the other reaching back every few moments to check on the frail figure lying across the back seat. His father was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, his skin an alarming shade of ashen gray. Marcus had never seen him like this before, not even in the worst moments of their lives. Peter Ewells had always been a man of strength, a pillar that held up not only his family, but the countless patients whose lives he had saved. Now he lay crumpled and fragile, a mere shadow of the force he had once been. The sight of him like this sent a violent rage coursing through Marcus's veins. He had arrived just in time, just minutes after his father had been discarded like garbage onto the street behind the hospital. He still couldn't process it. He couldn't fathom how they could do this, how supposed professionals could look at a man on the brink of death and decide he wasn't worth saving simply because a transaction hadn't gone through. He had money, power, influence. None of it had mattered in that moment when his father had needed them the most. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, catching the faint rise and fall of Peter's chest. His father's lips were parted slightly, as if he wanted to speak but lacked the strength. Marcus clenched his jaw, shifting gears as he sped through the city, weaving between cars with reckless urgency. He had called ahead, ensuring that the best doctors in the city would be waiting for them at a different hospital, one where his name carried weight, where the people owed him favors, where he could personally ensure his father would receive the care he deserved. The sky outside was turning a muted shade of orange, the day slipping away into evening, but Marcus barely registered the passage of time. He focused only on getting his father to safety, on making sure the people responsible for this would suffer for what they had done. His mind played over the details relentlessly, the rage growing sharper with every mile. Peter stirred slightly, his fingers twitching against the seat. Marcus reached back again, his voice softer now, but firm. "I'm here, Dad. Just hold on." The drive felt endless, but finally the sleek black car screeched to a halt in front of the entrance to the private medical facility he had called. Before the tires had even fully stopped, the doors swung open and a team of doctors and nurses rushed forward, their movements swift and practiced. A stretcher was waiting, and Marcus wasted no time, throwing open the back door and helping guide his father's frail form onto it. He barely registered the voices around him, rapid medical terms exchanged between doctors, questions about symptoms and vitals. All he could focus on was the fact that they were treating him, that they weren't hesitating. One of the attending physicians, a middle-aged man with a sharp, discerning gaze, placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder as the team began wheeling Peter inside. "We'll take care of him, I promise." Marcus gave a short, curt nod, his throat tight with unspoken emotion. The next few hours were a blur of waiting. Marcus paced the pristine waiting area, the sterile white walls and dim lighting doing nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. His fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing between two thoughts: whether his father would pull through and how he would make those responsible pay. The doors to the operating wing finally swung open, and the lead doctor emerged, pulling down his surgical mask. His expression was neutral, professional, but not grim. Marcus exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. "He's stable for now," the doctor said, his voice calm but measured. "He suffered a myocardial infarction, and it was aggravated by prolonged stress and lack of immediate intervention. If you had gotten him here any later—" He trailed off, letting the silence finish the sentence. Marcus's jaw tightened. He already knew. He didn't need the doctor to tell him how close it had been. "What now?" he asked, his voice low. "We'll keep him under observation. He'll need extensive monitoring, but he's strong. It's good you got to him when you did." Marcus nodded stiffly. He wanted to thank the doctor, but the words felt foreign in his mouth. Instead, he moved past him, making his way toward the private room where they had transferred his father. The sight of Peter lying there, hooked up to monitors and IV drips, sent a fresh wave of anger rolling through him. This shouldn't have happened. His father shouldn't have been in this position in the first place. He pulled a chair up to the bedside, settling in without a word. He wasn't going anywhere. Not until his father woke up. The minutes stretched into hours, and at some point Marcus must have drifted off because the next thing he knew, a faint stirring made his eyes snap open. Peter's fingers twitched slightly, his eyelids fluttering before slowly opening. His gaze was hazy, unfocused, but when his eyes found Marcus, a flicker of recognition passed through them. Marcus leaned forward, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Dad." Peter's lips parted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You found me." Something inside Marcus cracked. He had always prided himself on control, on keeping his emotions tightly reined in. But now, sitting here, watching his father fight to stay conscious after everything that had been done to him, he felt something dangerously close to breaking. "Of course, I found you," he murmured. "I always will." Peter's eyes drifted shut again, but this time it wasn't the unconsciousness of a body on the brink of collapse. It was rest. Real rest. Marcus sat back, his jaw set, his mind already shifting gears. His father was safe now. That was what mattered. But the people who had done this to him, the doctors who had looked at him and deemed him unworthy of care, were not. And they were about to learn exactly what it meant to cross Marcus Ewell's. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the quiet hospital room, a steady reminder that Peter Ewells was still here, still fighting. The soft glow of the overhead lights cast long shadows against the pale walls, the sterile scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. Marcus sat beside his father's bed, his back stiff, his hands clasped together as he watched the slow, measured rise and fall of his father's chest. He had barely moved in hours. He couldn't. Not until he knew for certain that his father was safe. Peter stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering open just enough for his weary gaze to meet his son's. His expression was weak but steady, his lips parting as though he wanted to speak. Marcus leaned forward, his fingers gripping the edge of the bed as he waited. "You found me?" Peter murmured, his voice hoarse. Marcus exhaled sharply, a quiet, bitter laugh escaping his throat. "Yeah, Dad, I found you." A long silence stretched between them. Peter's eyes held the weight of exhaustion, but beneath it there was something else, something deeper. "They left me," he whispered. Marcus's jaw clenched, his grip tightening. "I know." His father's gaze shifted, scanning the room, the pristine walls, the quiet hum of the machines that were finally doing what the other hospital had refused to. His fingers twitched weakly against the blanket, his brows furrowing as he struggled to piece together the fragmented memories. "They just put me outside," he rasped. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He had spent years perfecting his control, mastering the art of keeping his emotions in check. But hearing those words, spoken so softly yet carrying so much betrayal, sent a fresh wave of rage coursing through him. He had already seen the footage. His security team had retrieved the surveillance recordings from St. James Hospital, every second of the ordeal, from the moment the doctors had refused treatment to the instant his father had been thrown out onto the cold pavement like he was nothing. His father, one of the most respected surgeons of his time. A man who had spent his life saving others, now discarded like garbage by the very institution that had sworn to heal. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low, steady. "I know what they did to you, Dad, and I'm going to make sure they never do it to anyone else." Peter's eyes lingered on him, searching. He had always known his son to be relentless, a force of nature when it came to protecting the people he cared about. But there was something different in Marcus's expression now, something colder. "This isn't just about you," Marcus continued. "How many other people have they done this to? How many more have been turned away because they didn't have the right insurance or because they didn't look like the kind of patient they wanted in their hospital?" Peter closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling softly. He knew the answer. He had seen it throughout his career. The quiet dismissals, the administrative loopholes that kept certain people from receiving the care they needed. But even knowing that, he had never imagined he would be on the receiving end of it. "You can't let this consume you," he murmured. Marcus's jaw tensed. He wasn't interested in lectures about restraint. Not this time. "I already started the investigation," he said. "I have my legal team pulling financial records, patient files, everything." Peter's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "Marcus, I'm not just going after them for what they did to you," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm going after everything, their funding, their licenses, their reputation. By the time I'm done, there won't be a single person in this city who trusts St. James Hospital." Peter studied him for a long moment. He had spent his life believing in justice, in fairness, in the idea that the medical field should be above corruption. But he had also spent his life understanding the brutal realities of the world. He knew his son. He knew that once Marcus set his sights on something, he wouldn't stop until he had seen it through. Peter exhaled, shifting slightly against the pillows. "Just be careful." Marcus nodded, but the fire in his eyes remained. He stood, adjusting his suit jacket as he reached for his phone. His security detail was already waiting outside. He had calls to make, meetings to arrange. This wasn't just about justice. This was about making an example of them. He turned back to his father one last time before heading for the door. "Rest, Dad. You don't have to worry about anything." Peter watched him go, his mind clouded with exhaustion. He wanted to believe that Marcus's pursuit of justice wouldn't come at a cost, but deep down he knew his son too well. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was war. The office of the hospital's board of directors was a polished chamber of glass and steel, a place where decisions were made with cold precision, where wealth and power dictated the course of medical ethics. It was on the top floor of St. James Hospital, an architectural masterpiece designed to exude prestige and authority. The long mahogany conference table gleamed under the recessed lighting, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline. It was a place where problems were dealt with behind closed doors, where reputations were built and destroyed in hushed voices over fine whiskey. Seated around the table were the key figures of the hospital's administration. Dr. Walter Grayson, the chief medical officer, sat at the head, his fingers steepled as he studied the anxious faces of his colleagues. To his right was Dr. Samuel Livingston, head of patient admissions, his face taut with tension. Dr. Jessica Barnes, director of hospital operations, sat stiffly beside him, tapping a manicured nail against the table. Alongside them were senior executives, legal advisors, and financial officers, all wearing expressions that ranged from worried to outright panicked. The air was thick with unease. In the past week, St. James Hospital had found itself caught in the eye of a brewing storm. At first, it had seemed like a minor incident. An elderly patient turned away due to lack of payment. It was hardly the first time such a thing had happened. But something was different this time. It had begun with the quiet withdrawal of several key suppliers. A pharmaceutical distributor had suddenly pulled out of its contract, citing unforeseen logistical issues. Then, a major medical equipment provider had followed suit, claiming compliance concerns. The hospital's board had initially dismissed it as an unfortunate coincidence, but when a regulatory body announced an unscheduled audit of their financial records, alarms began to ring. Then came the calls from investors, hedge fund partners, and private donors who had supported the hospital for years, suddenly expressing concerns over recent ethical scrutiny. The hospital's accounts were being scrutinized, revenue streams threatened, and whispers of malpractice investigations had begun circulating in influential circles. And now, the reason for it all was about to walk through their doors. The double doors of the boardroom swung open with a quiet but commanding force, and the room fell into absolute silence as Marcus Ewells entered. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his presence sharp and imposing. He moved with the kind of authority that wasn't demanded but commanded naturally, the effortless dominance of a man who had spent years at the top of the corporate world. His dark eyes swept across the room, taking in every detail, every nervous expression, every subtle shift in posture. He was not here for negotiations. He was here for judgment. Behind him followed two men, both dressed in equally expensive suits, their faces unreadable. Lawyers, the kind that specialized in dismantling institutions brick by brick. Dr. Grayson straightened in his seat, clearing his throat in an attempt to regain control of the room. "Mr. Ewells," he said with forced cordiality, "I assume there's been some misunderstanding. If we had known your father was—" Marcus's hand came up, cutting him off with a single deliberate gesture. The room fell silent again. "There was no misunderstanding," Marcus said, his voice smooth but laced with steel. "Your hospital made a conscious decision to turn away a man in need of critical care. You discarded him like he was nothing, and now you're going to face the consequences of that decision." Dr. Barnes shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mr. Ewells, we understand your frustration, but there are protocols." Marcus turned his gaze to her, and she immediately fell silent. "You don't understand anything," he said, "but you will." He reached into the inside pocket of his suit and pulled out a thick folder. With calculated precision, he placed it on the table and slid it forward. One of the legal advisors hesitated before picking it up and flipping it open. Inside were documents. Not just about his father, but about dozens of other patients. Names, case files, financial records, every instance where St. James Hospital had denied treatment to individuals who couldn't provide immediate payment. Every case where medical ethics had been overridden in favor of financial gain. The lawyer paled as he read through the pages. Dr. Livingston leaned over to glance at the files, his complexion growing noticeably ashen. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's expression remained impassive. "I have resources." The meaning was clear. St. James Hospital had operated for years under the assumption that its actions would never be questioned, that no one would have the means or the will to dig deep enough to expose what lay beneath the surface. But Marcus Ewells was not just anyone. He had the power to unearth every skeleton they had buried, and he had done exactly that. Dr. Grayson forced a calm expression, though his fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the folder. "Mr. Ewells, we understand your concerns, but these are internal matters." "No," Marcus interrupted, leaning forward. "These are public matters now, because in 24 hours this information will be handed over to regulatory agencies, government oversight committees, and every major news outlet in the country." A murmur of panic rippled through the room. The financial executives exchanged nervous glances, already calculating the potential fallout. "You can't do that," Dr. Barnes said, her voice sharp with disbelief. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I can, and I will." Dr. Livingston shifted forward, his voice carefully measured. "What do you want?" Marcus exhaled slowly, letting the weight of his words settle over them. "I want accountability. I want the people responsible for my father's treatment, Dr. Grayson, Dr. Livingston, Dr. Barnes, terminated immediately. And I want a full overhaul of your patient intake policies." Dr. Grayson's face darkened. "That's impossible." Marcus's expression didn't change. "Then your hospital closes." The silence that followed was suffocating. The board members glanced at one another, some of them already calculating the inevitable collapse of St. James if Marcus followed through on his threat. Their investors would pull out. The lawsuits alone would be enough to drain them. If they refused, the hospital would not survive. Dr. Barnes was the first to break. She slumped back in her chair, exhaling sharply. She knew they had no choice. "We'll do it," she murmured. Dr. Grayson's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening as he stared at Marcus. He had built his career on control, on the knowledge that he held the power in any room he entered. But now, that power had been stripped away from him. Marcus gave a slow nod. "Good." He stood, buttoning his jacket. "You'll have 24 hours to announce their resignations and the new policies. If you try to protect them, if you attempt to cover this up, I'll make sure every person in this city knows exactly what kind of place this hospital is." He turned to leave, his presence still heavy in the air. Before stepping out, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "And one more thing," he added, his voice cool and measured. "The next time a man walks through those doors in need of help, you treat him like a human being. Or I'll be back, and I won't be nearly as polite." Then, without another word, he walked out, leaving behind only the weight of his ultimatum. The room remained in stunned silence. For the first time in years, the powerful men and women who had controlled the fate of St. James Hospital found themselves at the mercy of someone far more powerful than them. And, for the first time, they understood what it meant to be afraid. The sun had barely begun its descent when Marcus stepped out of the boardroom, the weight of victory settling onto his shoulders. The long, dimly lit hallway stretched ahead, the silence of the hospital pressing in around him. His polished shoes echoed against the marble floor as he made his way toward the exit, the conversations still raging inside the boardroom left behind like the remnants of a crumbling empire. He didn't need to stay to hear their desperate scrambling. The decision had already been made. The air outside was crisp, the late afternoon breeze carrying with it the scent of city life, exhaust fumes, distant coffee, the faint aroma of street food vendors setting up for the evening rush. His black car waited at the curb, his driver standing by the door, ever patient. But Marcus didn't get in. Not yet. He stood for a moment, looking up at the gleaming glass facade of St. James Hospital. From the outside, it still bore the illusion of prestige, of excellence. To the people who walked in, it was a sanctuary, a place where lives were saved. But Marcus knew better now. He knew that behind its shining walls lay cold calculations, the weighing of human life against profit margins. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He already knew who it was before he even glanced at the screen. "It's done," he said as he answered. His head of legal, Robert Klein, exhaled on the other end. They didn't have a choice. The resignations will be filed by morning. Grayson, Livingston, and Barnes out. The board is preparing a public statement about their departure and the new vision for patient care. But you already knew that. Marcus's gaze remained fixed on the hospital. And the media? The press releases are ready. We'll leak the internal documents tomorrow. They'll have no time to spin the narrative before the headlines write themselves. A pause. Then Robert's voice lowered slightly. You did what you set out to do, Marcus. You dismantled them. For the first time in days, Marcus allowed himself to exhale fully. But the tension in his chest didn't fully ease. It wasn't just about the destruction of 3 doctors' careers. It was about something bigger, about ensuring that no one else had to go through what his father had endured. "How's your father?" Robert asked. "He's stable, resting," Marcus replied. "I'll be back at the hospital soon." Robert hesitated for a moment. "You know, this isn't just going to disappear after today. You took on an institution, Marcus. They're going to fight to rebuild. Some of them will hate you for this." Marcus finally turned away from St. James Hospital and walked toward his car. Then they'd better be careful whose name they put in their mouths. He ended the call and got in, the door shutting with a quiet finality. By the time he arrived back at his father's private hospital, the quiet hum of machines filled the room, steady and reassuring. Peter was still asleep, his breathing more even now, color returning to his face. The sight of him like this, alive, healing, was the only thing that kept the rage in Marcus's chest from fully consuming him. He sank into the chair beside the bed, resting his elbows on his knees. The exhaustion he had been ignoring for days was beginning to creep in, the adrenaline that had fueled him since that first moment of panic now fading. He didn't know how much time passed before his father stirred. Slowly, Peter's eyes opened, the hazel depths clearer than they had been in days. His gaze found Marcus, and a faint smile ghosted across his lips. "You look tired," Peter murmured. Marcus let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That's what you have to say?" His father shifted slightly, the movement slow but deliberate. "It's done, isn't it?" Marcus nodded. "They're finished. I made sure of it." Peter studied him for a long moment before exhaling softly. "I know you did. But tell me, son, did it make you feel any better?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he had an answer to give. There had been satisfaction, certainly. Justice, perhaps. But did it feel like enough? "I didn't do this for revenge," he finally said. "I did it because no one else could." Peter's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that Marcus couldn't quite place. A sadness, maybe, or understanding. "I'm proud of you," Peter said quietly. "But I don't want this to harden you, Marcus. There's a fine line between justice and destruction. You need to know when to stop." Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He understood what his father was saying, but it didn't change the truth. The world wasn't built for mercy. It was built for those who seized control before it could be taken from them. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. A nurse stepped inside, offering a polite smile. "I just need to check his vitals," she said. Marcus stood, stepping aside as she moved to his father's bedside. Peter gave him a knowing look. "Go home," he said. "Get some sleep." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. But as he left the room, he knew sleep wouldn't come. Not yet. The city was watching. And he wasn't done just yet. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady hum of the monitors and the occasional rustle of fabric as Peter shifted slightly in his bed. The sterile white walls, the polished linoleum floors, and the muted scent of antiseptic all blended into a monotonous background. For days now, this had been Marcus's world, a confined space filled with the sounds of machines keeping his father alive, nurses whispering updates, and the occasional interruption of his own ringing phone. But now, for the first time since this ordeal began, the tension in his chest had started to ease. His father was healing. Slowly but surely, the color had returned to Peter's face. The sharp lines of pain that had etched themselves into his features had softened. His breathing was stronger, and though he still tired easily, there was a vitality in his gaze that hadn't been there before. He was on the mend, and that was all that mattered. Marcus sat beside the bed, his suit jacket draped over the chair, his tie loosened. His phone lay on the small table beside him, silent for now, though he knew that wouldn't last long. The fallout from St. James Hospital was still unfolding. Reporters were already circling like vultures, news stations scrambling to get their hands on the leaked documents. The resignations had been announced that morning. Grayson, Livingston, and Barnes were out, their careers in shambles. The hospital had issued a carefully worded statement about policy changes and a commitment to patient care, but the damage had already been done. Marcus had won, but as he sat there, watching his father rest, he found himself wondering why the victory didn't feel as satisfying as he thought it would. Peter stirred, blinking groggily as he turned his head toward his son. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice rough from sleep. Marcus gave a small smirk. "Where else would I be?" Peter exhaled softly, his gaze searching. "You did it, didn't you?" Marcus nodded, leaning back in his chair. "It's over. They're done." Peter studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction, just quiet understanding. He had seen this before, seen men build their entire lives around battles that consumed them, leaving little else behind. "Good," Peter said finally. "But what now?" Marcus frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" His father sighed, shifting against the pillows. "I mean, what do you do after this? You spent all your time focused on bringing them down. Now that it's done, what's left?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he had an answer. For days, he had been running on adrenaline, fueled by the singular goal of justice, or vengeance, depending on how one looked at it. He had moved like a storm through the city, dismantling the hospital's leadership, ensuring that their corruption was exposed. But now, with the fight over, there was nothing left to chase. Peter seemed to sense his thoughts. "Marcus, I didn't survive just for you to lose yourself in this." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I didn't lose myself. I did what had to be done." "I know," Peter said softly, "and I'm grateful. But you need to ask yourself why you did this. Was it just for me?" Marcus looked away, staring at the floor. He had told himself that this was about his father, about making sure no one else was ever left to die on the street like that. But if he was honest with himself, there had been more to it than that. He had needed to prove something, to himself, to the world. He had needed to remind everyone, including those who had wronged his father, that power wasn't just about money or influence. It was about knowing when to strike, when to burn everything down and rebuild it in your image. But now that the fire had died down, he was left standing in the ashes, wondering what came next. Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. Marcus turned, already knowing who it would be. The moment the door opened, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Walter Grayson, Samuel Livingston, and Jessica Barnes stood just outside, their postures stiff, their faces pale. They had once carried themselves with the arrogance of untouchable professionals, men and women who had built their reputations on control and authority. Now they looked like ghosts of their former selves. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't need to. The weight of his presence alone was enough to make them hesitate before stepping inside. Grayson was the first to break the silence. His voice was quieter than before, the usual condescension absent. "We wanted to speak with Dr. Ewells." Peter's gaze flickered toward Marcus before turning back to the disgraced doctors. "Go ahead," he said, his voice calm. Grayson swallowed hard, his hands clenching at his sides. "We didn't know." Marcus let out a quiet scoff, leaning back in his chair. "Didn't know what? That he was my father? That he was a surgeon? That he wasn't some homeless man you could throw onto the street?" His voice was cold, each word cutting like a blade. "Tell me, Grayson, if you had known, would that have changed anything? Would you have treated him differently?" Grayson flinched, his gaze dropping to the floor. Livingston cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "We made a mistake." "A mistake?" Marcus repeated, the words dripping with disbelief. "You didn't misplace paperwork. You didn't prescribe the wrong dosage. You made a conscious decision to abandon a man in need of medical attention because he didn't fit your preferred patient profile." Jessica Barnes, who had remained silent until now, took a small step forward. "We came here because we wanted to apologize." Marcus laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "You think an apology erases what you did?" Barnes's expression tightened. "No," she admitted, "but we needed to say it anyway." The room was heavy with silence. Peter watched them carefully, his face unreadable. "I don't want your apologies," Marcus said finally. "I want to know that this never happens again. Not just because you're out of a job, not because your names are ruined, but because you understand what you did was wrong." Grayson's shoulders slumped. "We do," he said quietly. Peter exhaled softly. "Then leave." The three of them hesitated, then nodded, turning toward the door. Just as they reached it, Marcus spoke again. "Remember this moment," he said, his voice even. "Remember what it feels like to have your entire world fall apart because of a choice you made. Because this time you were lucky. You get to walk away." None of them responded. They simply left, their figures disappearing down the hallway. The room was quiet once more. Marcus turned back to his father, expecting some kind of lecture, some measured wisdom about forgiveness. But Peter only looked at him with quiet understanding. "You did what you had to do," Peter said finally. Marcus exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I did." And for the first time in days, he felt something close to peace. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more compelling stories. And if this one resonated with you, share it with someone who might find it just as powerful.